The story of Judges 19 and the following chapters is among the most shocking and revolting narratives in all of Scripture. The harshness of the old host and the Levite, as well as the monstrosity of the men of Gibeah, leaves us speechless before the abomination. Yet the actions of the old man and the Levite in chapter 19 are only the beginning of a litany of cruelties, crimes and catastrophes, as the evils of that night in Gibeah explode into a conflagration that has devastated the entire nation and has nearly eradicated the tribe of Benjamin from Israel. Despite the violence and wickedness of Judges 19:21, this dark passage of Israel's history is not excluded from the musical order of the Scriptures. On the contrary, its meaning is fully perceived only in the context of this larger order, as within it is connected to other events and eras. Indeed, its presence at the end of Judges, although out of historical sequence, serves to frame it as a narrative that culminates in expressing the moral state of Israel without a king, highlighting the themes of the book, just as the events of 2 Samuel 24, also out of historical sequence, serve to highlight the movement of the themes of the book towards the future establishment of the temple. The account that opens in chapter 19 is about a Levite who was a concubine to a young woman from Bethlehem. After a dispute, she returned to her father's house. The Levite went after her to bring her back. They stopped at Gibeah, a city belonging to the tribe of Benjamin. No one took them in for the night until an old man gave them shelter. But the men of the city surrounded the house, demanding to abuse the Levite. Facing their diabolical determination, the old man offered his own daughter to them. When they refused, the concubine was thrown outside instead. She endured unspeakable violence throughout the night and died on the threshold in the morning. The Levite loaded her on his donkey and went home as if nothing had happened. There, he cut her body into 12 pieces and sent them to the tribes of Israel. This sparked an appalling spiral of violence that would consume the entire nation. A war broke out between all the tribes and the tribe of Benjamin, who protected the guilty. After 2 crushing defeats, the tribes of Israel desperately looked for women for the surviving Benjamites, so that the tribe would not die out. It is on this final horror that the book of Judges ends, a book that depicts 3 centuries of a descent into hell, culminating in the paroxysm of the end. Most attentive readers of this text will quickly understand that it invites a deep comparison with the story of Lot and Sodom in Genesis 19. In both cases, 2 visitors arrive in a wicked city in the evening, Genesis 19:1, Judges 19:14-15. They plan to stay in the public square, Genesis 19:2, Judges 19:15, but at the insistence of a man from the city, in both cases someone whose origins were from outside the city, they stay in his house, Genesis 19:2-3, Judges 19:16-20, where they are fed and given drink, Genesis 19:3, Judges 19:21. The house is then surrounded by men of the city who want to rape the male visitors, Genesis 19:4-5, Judges 19:22. The men of the city are rebuffed by the host, Genesis 19:6-7, Judges 19:23, who offers 2 women to the crowd instead of the male guest, Genesis 19:8, Judges 19:24. In both accounts, much attention is given to the doorframe as the threshold between safety and death, Genesis 19:6, 9, 11, Judges 19:22-26-27, and to the contrast between night and dawn, Genesis 19:1, 2, 15, 23, 27, Judges 19:11, 14, 15, 25, 26. In both cases, the result is the condemnation of the wicked city by the visitors, Genesis 19:13, Judges 19:29-30, leading to its total destruction, Genesis 19:23-29, Judges 20. The death of a woman at dawn, Genesis 19:26, Judges 19:26, followed by an unsuccessful or tragic attempt at repopulation, Genesis 19:38, Judges 21. There are striking contrasts between these accounts. Lot puts himself in extreme danger to protect his guests, going out to the crowd to speak to them directly, Genesis 19:6-9. He offered his daughters to the crowd in an extreme measure intended to protect his guests. By contrast, the old man of Gibeah offered his daughter and the Levite's concubine, one of his guests. And it is possible that the old man only offered hospitality to the Levite when he realized he was from the same region as him, Judges 19:16-20. Ultimately, it is the concubine, a guest, who was thrown out to the hostile crowd. Lot's guilty willingness to sacrifice his daughters was a lesser evil somewhat mitigated by the fact that he was clearly motivated by the extreme demands of hospitality. The old man of Gibeah, who did not seem to be in personal danger himself, was ready to sacrifice a guest. In Genesis 19, the angelic guests protect those who are in the house and prevent harm coming to Lot. Rather than allow the crowd to do what seemed right to them, cf. Judges 19:24, they strike the crowd with blindness. The Levite, by contrast, does not act as a guardian but is willing to sacrifice his concubine to save his own skin. The Levite displays a shocking indifference towards his concubine. One gets the impression that he withdraws for the night while she is being brutally raped outside. In the morning, he wakes up and, eager to be on his way, harshly addresses her, without even betraying the slightest concern for her well-being, after the horrible treatment she had suffered during the night, Judges 19:27. In the parallels between Gibeah and Sodom, we see that Israel had fallen to the level of repeating the most striking sin of the people who inhabited the land before them, a fact accentuated by the Levite having deliberately chosen to stay in Gibeah rather than a non-Israelite town in verses 11-12. As a result, Gibeah suffered the same destruction as the paradigmatic Sodom and cities of the plain, its smoke rising to heaven, Judges 20:40, cf. Genesis 19:28. This judgment and its unpleasant aftermath bring the era of the Judges to its darkest point. If the golden calf was Israel's initial fall at Sinai, Gibeah is the great fall of Israel in the land, the sin that reveals they had become indistinguishable from the people they were sent to drive out. Before being enveloped by the thick darkness of Gibeah and its terrors, the narrative of Judges 19 opens with a strange but faintly foreboding vignette. The Levite, seeking the return of his unfaithful concubine, goes to Bethlehem to win her back. He finds her and speaks kindly to her, after which he brings him into her father's house, where the Levite receives generous hospitality. Several verses are devoted to describing the Levite's extended stay in his father-in-law's house. The father-in-law successfully delays the Levite's departure 5 times until finally the Levite insists on leaving. A sense of an urgent, dangerously delayed journey emerges. The delay of their departure from the father-in-law's house is one of the triggering factors for the events that follow. In his commentary on the book, James Jordan notes, "We cannot but notice how the writer stresses how the father-in-law tried to hold back the Levite. We might expect the writer to say that the girl's father tried to encourage the Levite to prolong his visit. But when we read over and over that the father-in-law persuaded him to stay a little longer, we are alerted to a theme of retention. Now the Levite was a man with a calling, a task. He was supposed to be the pastor of a local community in the remote part of Ephraim. Being away too long would result in neglecting his task. Thus, after 3 days, he wants to leave. The girl's father, however, holds him back. This reminds us of Laban, how he sought to retain Jacob, and Israel's retention by Pharaoh. Again, There is no hint of a moral parallel between this father-in-law and Laban or Pharaoh, but there is a formal parallel. 3 days is indeed the fitting time for a definitive break, to pursue one's way. But the father-in-law persuades him to stay longer. In total, the father-in-law tries to retain the Levite 5 times, v4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The number of verses devoted to this episode and the frequent repetitions within it suggest this is a more significant part of the narrative than often assumed. This episode placed on the threshold of the narrative is telling of the dramas to come. In verse 13, reference is made to Ramah, which in Jeremiah 31. 15 is associated with Rachel, who died after giving birth to Benjamin on the road to Bethlehem, Genesis 35, 16, 20. Faintly resonating beneath the surface of the text, we hear the story of Rachel, a woman retained too long with her husband in her father's house, who later died on an interrupted journey on the road to Bethlehem. The treatment of the Levite's concubine by the Benjaminites of Gibeah takes on added tragic meaning when the similarities with Rachel are taken into account. The Benjaminites kill a woman who recalls the mother who died giving birth to them. As a consequence of their crime, the tribe of Benjamin itself will be nearly annihilated. A tale of nocturnal death at the threshold recalls the great events of the Exodus, as the Israelites prepared for the plague of the death of the firstborn, and the celebration of Passover by marking the doorposts and lintels of their houses with blood. Several important themes surround the Passover event, including the themes of childbirth and the firstborn. Through the Passover, the Lord set apart for himself all the firstborn males of Israel. Exodus 13:2, Numbers 3:13. Later he took the Levites instead of the firstborn. Numbers 3:12, 13, 40, 51. The Levites were charged with keeping the Lord's house and representing the divine husband to his bride. Through the events of the Exodus, the Levites were set apart as the threshold tribe. They were the liminal tribe who maintained proper boundaries and crossings of them. They defended the realms against encroachments. They themselves dwelt on the threshold of Israel, neither wholly alien nor wholly familiar. They had been set apart from the nation as the Lord's special possession. They had no territory like the other tribes, their inheritance being the service of the Lord. Joshua 18:7. Levite cities were located within other territories, and all the cities of refuge were Levite cities. That the main protagonist of the Judges 19 narrative is a Levite is noteworthy, if only because it reveals something of the importance of the themes of inhospitality that pervade the narrative. Although the Levite walks in the Lord's house, no one will receive him into their house. Verse 18. That the visitor was a Levite aggravates the inhospitality of the city. The Levite represents the Lord and has a particular dependence on Israel's hospitality. That no one offers him hospitality is a sign of the attitude of the city's inhabitants toward the God who gave them their dwelling place in the land. It also accentuates the cruelty and wickedness of the Levite in his treatment of his concubine. The Levite is charged with guarding Israel's thresholds, protecting the Lord's bride, and representing the loving divine husband. The Levite's life is threatened, as were the firstborns in the Exodus, and being on the right side of a protective threshold was crucial. However, rather than guarding the threshold, the Levite allows his safety to be purchased at the price of his concubine's life. Rather than protecting the bride, the Levite throws her to Gibeah's dogs to be torn apart. Rather than representing Israel's divine husband, the Levite displays exquisite indifference towards his concubine. The concubine and the Levite are figures for Israel and her religious guardians. What emerges from this text is a devastating indictment of Israel's religious guardians. The guardians are indifferent to the bride of the Lord's safety and well-being. They have abandoned their post at the threshold and have rendered the very place elsewhere associated with new birth a site of death. Israel, the bride, after pursuing her sin and being badly mistreated by those who should have guarded her, is now dismembered, cut into 12 pieces. In the first book of Samuel, there is a striking replay of the themes of Judges 19:21, as Saul is established as Israel's new guardian. The story of the Levite and the concubine begins with the Levite, his servant, and 2 donkeys setting out in search of the lost concubine. Saul's story begins with Saul and a servant setting out in search of some lost donkeys. However, Saul soon learned that the donkeys had already been found, and that it was he who had been found, the much sought-after husband of the nation, the one on whom was all the desire of Israel. 1 Samuel 9:20. Samuel also gave Saul the priest's portion of the meal, 9:24, perhaps identifying him as a quasi-priestly guardian of the nation's house. Saul himself was a Benjamite, a man of a tribe that had been nearly entirely annihilated. When Saul speaks to Samuel, "Am I not a Benjamite of the smallest of the tribes of Israel?" The whole history of Gibeah and the ensuing national tragedy hovers in the background. Indeed, Saul came from the very town of Gibeah, the town whose wickedness had occasioned the near extermination of Benjamin. 1 Samuel 10:26, 11:4. However, from the ashes of the tribe of Benjamin, the Lord laid the foundations of the kingdom. The story of the Levite and his concubine opens with a reference to the fact that there was no king in Israel in those days. In Saul's story, we see this issue being addressed. Gibeah is not the only significant place name in Saul's story. Saul receives the first sign of the foretold kingdom near the tomb of Rachel, 1 Samuel 10:2, the place where the mother of the tribe of Benjamin had died in childbirth, and which had since become associated with the near destruction of the tribe, became the site where the first shoots of new life pierced the once scorched earth. In 1 Samuel 11:1, the town of Jabesh-Gilead is severely threatened by Nahash the Ammonite. In Judges 21, the town of Jabesh-Gilead had been almost entirely destroyed for not joining the rest of Israel in their fight against the Benjamites. News of the peril of Jabesh-Gilead reached Saul in Gibeah. As the Levite had cut his concubine's body into pieces and sent it throughout Israel, Saul cut a yoke of oxen into pieces and sent the pieces throughout Israel, calling all to respond to his summons or suffer the same fate. 1 Samuel 11:7. However, unlike the Levite, Saul handled the situation justly. The Levite's actions following the rape and murder of his concubine were largely a continuation of his shameful selfishness and callousness. He treated his concubine's body as an accessory and pursued destructive vengeance while concealing his own complicity in the affair. Cf. Judges 24:6. He is at the center of his account of events. The lords of Gibeah rose up against him, surrounded the house because of him, and sought to kill him. He does not mention the fact that he allowed his concubine to be thrown to the crowd, somehow managing to present himself as if he were the chief victim. If there had been a king in Israel, one suspects these events would have been handled more carefully. Instead, as in the case of Dinah in Genesis 34, the mistreatment of a woman was responded to, not with true justice, but with an explosion of male-centered vengeance, resulting in other women as victims, especially in chapter 21. When Jabesh-Gilead was surrounded by threatening men, calling for them to come out to face cruel fate, 1 Samuel 11:2-3, Israel's new guardian, the Spirit of God upon him, fought to protect them. The atrocity of Gibeah and its terrible aftermath are overcome, as the themes of Israel's sin are reprised and slowly undone by divine grace. Old associations of wickedness are replaced with new associations of the Lord's deliverance and goodness. Jabesh-Gilead becomes the site of rescue. Gibeah, once synonymous with the worst wickedness, is now Gibeah of Saul, 1 Samuel 11:4, 15:34, 2 Samuel 21:6, Isaiah 10:29. The Levite goes first to Bethlehem because his concubine had played the harlot and returned to her father's house. At the start of the story, he seems a righteous man. He does not seek vengeance on her, but rather speaks kindly to her and seeks to win her back. Unfortunately, as the narrative unfolds, the Levite proves to be other than he first appeared. The events at Gibeah are only alluded to in one prophetic book, that of Hosea, 5:8-9-9-10-9. That Gibeah is mentioned in this particular book is no accident. The prophet Hosea himself is instructed to take an adulterous wife, illustrating Israel's spiritual adultery against her divine husband. 1:2. Hosea's prophetic actions and message declare a God who pursues and restores his adulterous bride in grace. Where priests and kings have proven neglectful or unfaithful in their charge, the Lord himself will seek and win back his people. 13:9-11. The Levite of Judges failed to represent the divine husband as he should have. However, in the book of Hosea, we see the divine husband who pursues, the one whose kind words to his bride do not prove empty. The Lord comes in person to deliver his bride from death's grip. 13:14. The book of Hosea is a book of changed names and destinies, where those who are called not my people are declared sons of the living God. 1:10. It anticipates one who will rewrite the darkest pages of Israel's history in the ink of his grace. Rather than throwing his bride to the murderous crowd, he will sacrifice himself for her. Under a sky stripped of its light, his will be the torn and pierced body. Unlike that Levite who once delivered up his concubine without resistance to the grave, this husband will wrest her from its clutches. Where murder once meant the loss of a people, his life-giving action will mean their resurrection from the dead. This resurrection of Christ will lift humanity from its deepest falls.